Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lisette Coley, and I serve as Parapsychology Foundation's Executive Director. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our President, Mrs. Eileen Coley, I welcome you here this evening to the reopening of our Fall Perspective series. Now, before we start, let's go through the bad news and the good news. Because obviously I want to address the rather bad news that you've probably seen that rather large for sale sign outside the building. And the foundation will be relocating in New York at some point, and we'll keep you posted as to where we wind up. It's a wrench to leave this beautiful building, but I would remind you that it is only bricks and mortar, and it is not the heart of the organization. And what really matters is the continuation of our programs and the expansion also of our programs. So I know you're going to bear with us and wish us well. And as I said, we will keep you posted. And let me tell you that when we look for new digs, new space, we will certainly take under consideration space, because our series, it's a very intimate gathering this evening. Now, that was the bad news, but the good news is that we remain at the foundation particularly enthusiastic about parapsychology and Parapsychology Foundation's future. That's evident by the launch of our Psychic Explorer Club, I guess last year, and now we have just launched, or will do formally in about 2 weeks, our electronic store, which is at www.scimart.com. That will carry all of the, say, 95 products, videos, proceedings, monographs, pamphlets that Parapsychology Foundation puts out, in addition to a reprint service, and also we want to stock in our shelves books that the Foundation can get behind of, really, as a clearinghouse for information. So there are about 20 books that will be added to titles that you can also purchase in the store. So again, it's www.scimart.com, and it's by no mistake that our speaker tonight's book is both available through Scimart, and I would say tonight I like to call it Scimart a la carte, because I get kind of funny in my old age, but it is available here at a slight discount. Normally it's $15.95, and for tonight it's $15, because if you've seen me making change at the front, you know I couldn't deal with the 95 cents. And of course that book is the Open-Minded Skeptic's Guide to After-Death Contacts.
And the author will be very happy to sign it.
Yes, definitely, yes, she will be available for signing. So now let's finish with my commercial and my news, and let's get to the subject at hand. We have the very distinct pleasure to introduce you to Professor Sylvia Hart Wright, whose book we've just mentioned, and you see it here and out front. She is a graduate of Cornell University, holding advanced degrees in sociology and information science. She is Professor Emerita, City University of New York, where she headed the library of the School of Architecture and Environmental Studies. How she became interested in our field is her story to tell, and so without further ado, I will turn you over to her capable hands as she discusses this evening Sensing Contact with the Dead, a Common Experience, Professor Sylvia Hart Wright.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much, Lisette, for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's always thrilling to me to be in New York, and particularly for an audience like this. Of course, I'm a native New Yorker. I'm a second-generation native New Yorker. I have been living for the last 12 years in Oregon, and I love Oregon too. But this is my hometown. So thank you all for coming. Let me dig out my notes, and then I'll get behind the podium and do what I can do. So. I should say, hiding behind a podium is not my favorite thing. I really have to have something to lean things on, but I love to sort of prowl around when I'm talking, so I'm going to be a little caged today, but we'll see how I can do. Anyhow, I guess it should be clear from Lisette's opening statements, I am not a medium. I am not a channeler. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm just a retired professor who's had what is a very common experience, and I will give you that in more detail, but the very short version is that I was widowed in 1983, and 64% of American widows report that they've sensed some kind of contact with their lost husbands. And of course, that also goes for people who've lost their partners. And for widowers, the numbers are a little lower, but you can probably guess it's around almost half. And I'll be going into that a little bit more in a minute. Also, I'm not talking about near-death experiences. This is something you experience when you're feeling perfectly well. You're not thinking about this lost loved one or whoever it is that's going to somehow make contact with you. And it's a spontaneous thing. It happens generally, as I said, when you least expect it. And that's one thing that makes it especially convincing, because you're not planning on it, you're not trying for it, it just comes. So I'll talk a little bit about how I got interested in the subject. As I say, I was widowed in 1983. And I, at that time, was a total agnostic. I didn't know the word paranormal. I mean, if you'd asked me to define it, I mean, I have 3 degrees from good schools. I didn't really know about paranormal. I would have called it supernatural. It was not an interest of mine. And as I say, I didn't believe in the afterlife at all. I thought primarily that there was no way that a human being would ever have access to that kind of information, and I had to just accept my own ignorance. And my husband at that time was, he went a step beyond me. He was an atheist, a total atheist, a noisy atheist. He was the kind of person who, when he saw an article or something that argued his position, he would make photocopies and hand them out to friends, not necessarily even close friends, you know, anyone who was vulnerable. So in any case, I'm going to read you how this all came about. Now, his name was Paul, and for the last several years of our marriage, he was going blind. He had diabetic retinopathy, and the last 2 years he was totally blind. But a few years before that, if he had enough light, he could read. So he went out and he bought a floor lamp that had 330 watts of light. It was 4 bulbs, 330 watts. And he was the only one in the house. I have a son who was 16 when Paul died. So the 3 of us, we all called it Paul's lamp, because Paul was the one who really used it that way with all 4 bulbs on. So this is what happened after he died. He died, well, it doesn't matter exactly when he died, but here we are. Around New Year's Day, he came down with pneumonia, and 3 weeks later he passed on. I never expected to sense him near me again. My 16-year-old son and I kept preparing for his memorial service in the open house we would hold that same day. For almost 2 weeks, those duties kept us focused. The day after the memorial service, and the day after the memorial service, it was a Sunday, I felt lonely, let down. Somehow, I would have to start the rest of my life, rebuilding it without him. Keith had a paper due the next day, that's my son. I offered to type it for him and pressed him to put his draft into final form. Of course, that was before the days where everyone had a computer and a printer. We were standing in the living room of our Manhattan high-rise apartment where the 2 of us had lived for 14 years. Paul's lamp, unlit, was a few feet away. Suddenly, it turned itself on. It turned itself on and started flashing strangely, short flashes of light that came infrequently and seemingly in response to things we said. At first, it was incomprehensible. "That's weird," Keith said. We looked at each other, bemused. Nothing like this had ever happened since Paul bought that lamp several years before. And there was nothing wrong with the wiring in the building. And nothing else in the apartment seemed to be affected. The refrigerator still droned on. Our hallway light glowed on, unchanging. Our eyes met, my son and I. And suddenly we both understood. Paul was contacting us. And I should say here that what we're getting is not just a light phenomenon, we're getting telepathy. We didn't know it at the time, but we were getting that kind of message. How better could he let us know that now he could tell the difference between light and dark? The blind man we loved could see again. We started laughing and crying and dancing around the lamp. Paul, who spoke French like a Frenchman, had lived in Paris for 5 happy years when he was young, had visited there often, had been the ultimate Francophile. Now you can go see Paris again, Keith said, and for a long moment the lamp blazed brighter. Twice that evening, Paul's lamp came on by itself and flickered for a time mysteriously. Afterwards, returning to our accustomed skepticism, we checked its bulbs and switches and the outlet where it was plugged in. Nothing we found accounted for the way it had behaved. The next day, I visited our church to pick up some phonograph records that had been played at Paul's memorial service. I should explain that we had met and married at the Universalist Church of New York on 76th and Central Park West, and you don't have to believe in God to be a member there. There is no creed. So anyhow, there I ran into Prabhat, a Hindu friend of Paul's. Prabhat was a thick-set, warm-hearted man in his 50s, trained as an engineer. As soon as he caught sight of me, his broad, dark face lit up. "I'm so glad to see you," he said. "I have something to tell you. Paul came to me in a dream. He took my hand. You know how he used to shake hands, very strong, very firm." Of course, wives never know how their husbands shake hands, but that's another story. You never shake hands with your husband. Anyhow, Prabhat said, "I could feel him with my hand. He said he was happy now, so I asked him to tell me more, to tell me where he was, what it had been like, to die. But then he disappeared, and the next thing, I woke up." Prabhat laughed. "That dream was so real. I got out of bed and looked all over the house for him." And this is an engineer. That was when I told him what had happened about the lamp. "You mustn't worry," he said. "It's perfectly natural. For 30 days after someone dies, he can wander the earth at will." He was speaking out of his Hindu tradition, happy to share it with me. So that's what Hindus believe, I thought. There are hundreds of millions of Hindus in the world, I figured, not to mention all the Buddhists who believe in reincarnation and the Chinese who practice ancestor worship. So they must believe in spirit survival too. Maybe, I decided, I'm not so crazy to believe that Paul's spirit may have survived. Well, that's where I start talking about other faith traditions. And really, our Judeo-Christian tradition, as we are taught it, because it's not a one-sided thing, but the way we have come to believe in it, and in the way that our materialistic society presents things, we are taught, if we're going to be educated people, we're not supposed to believe in any of this. But in fact, we're the oddballs. And it's not just the Buddhists and the Hindus and the Chinese who practice ancestor worship. The Africans also practice. Traditional African religion involves ancestor worship. And Native Americans also will have fires and give offerings to their ancestors. And that goes back to their similar practices in the Zoroastrians, who fed into a lot of Christian tradition. There are so many traditions that, to the Polynesians, to wherever, Shinto in Japan as well as Buddhism, there are so many traditions which just take this for granted. And if we think about it, these are not just things that people made up without any beginning. They are really evolving religions out of a shared human experience. So if all the peoples of the world, for millennia have experiencing certain things that have led them to believe certain things, then we have to take note of that. Anyhow, I should say also that in Europe, before Christianity came and to some degree was imposed, there was a lot of the same thing. Caesar, writing in the Gallic Wars, if I can get this straight, I reread this today, Caesar wrote about the Celts, that it was very hard to fight them because they were very brave. They felt that after death their spirits would go on into another body. The Gauls would throw messages to their dead on the funeral pyres of their latest people who died. So they would give the new people going to the afterlife messages for the people who had already arrived there. And there are similar practices actually among a Finnish group. I mean, I could go on and on. The book does have a chapter on this. I don't know how, I will skip over some of the other things in our European traditions, but I have to mention Halloween. How many people here know what Halloween is based on? Few people, yeah. Want to tell anyone?
Well, I know in Grenada, it's like a spiritual holiday when they go out among the grave sites and
really?
visit the dead. And it's not a scary thing, it's almost a sacred ceremony.
Yes?
Pre-Christian Europe and Celtic Europe, the holiday was known as Samhain.
Exactly.
And it was considered the New Year of the pagan New Year. And at that point, the barrier between the worlds was thinnest.
That's right. Yes, the spirits could work the earth, and the living could ascend to some degree to their world, and that is why we still carry it over in the idea of witches riding broomsticks at Halloween. Halloween was Samhain, and then the Christian church came in and was sort of taken aback because these people were still carrying on these pagan observances, and so they superimposed All Saints' Eve and the day of our All Saints or whatever holiday, and they put it right at the time of Samhain, and so the two got mixed together. But we ended up with the mischievous end of it, which was Halloween. Okay. Anyhow, I'll give you one quote I have to give you here, page 47, because it sort of sums it up. There's a man, Professor Paul Rosenblatt, evaluated what he called the ghost beliefs of 66 societies, including our own. Only one, the Maasai, about which only limited data were available, was judged to have no belief in spirits as manifestations of specific dead persons. Our own differed from most of the others by viewing ghosts as a topic for jokes, fanciful films, and fiction. To admit that one has perceived a ghost, or the action of a ghost, is to invite being labeled as ignorant, superstitious, irrational, or hallucinating. It is sobering, Rosenblatt and his colleagues observed, to find American culture so much in the minority on this issue. Okay, let's move on here. I should say that there have been studies about contemporary thought in the world, and one of the most interesting parts of that is what it is in societies where there is this belief in spirit contact. So here's a study that was done in Japan, which of course believes in this, takes it for granted. And a study of mourning in Japan was carried on by a Japanese-American psychiatrist in conjunction with a number of several other physicians who were Japanese. And they interviewed 30 Tokyo widows whose husbands had recently died in car accidents. And 27 out of the 30 sensed their presence afterwards. The author pointed out that Japan's two religions both assume the presence of the deceased, at least at times, and this is what he says. According to traditional rites, the spirits of the deceased can be called back to this world, usually by shamanistic rites similar to those widespread throughout Asia. If you were Japanese, you would feel in direct daily communication with your ancestors. The family altar would be your hotline. You could ring the bell, light incense, and talk over the current crisis with one whom you have loved and cherished. Well, back in the early 1970s, a Welsh physician did a study on a whole community, actually, that he served. And he interviewed around almost 300 people, and they were all widows or widowers, and they were basically all the ones he felt were healthy enough to be interviewed. Now, he was very fussy. He didn't include vivid dreams in the way he didn't include vivid dreams or a number of other things in what he considered contact experiences, or after-death communication is the expression that's usually used nowadays. Anyhow, he said that half the widowers and 46% of the widows had sensed some kind of after-death communication with their departed mate. Those who had them were not particularly depressed or socially isolated. Instead, they were more likely to have had longer marriages, happier marriages, and and marriages with children. So, in other words, it's about bonding. The ones who were closest were the ones who had these experiences. But actually, none of them had ever told, I think, their clergyman or clergy person, and only one had told a physician. Of all these 150, 160 people, none of them had confided in anyone about it because there's this taboo. There are a number of other studies among the other people who have, the other groups that have reported feelings like this, and I have them from several countries, are teenagers who've lost a sibling, young adults who have lost a parent, parents who've lost a child. And there was a really remarkable study that was done in Sweden in the early 1990s, a study of 14 widowers and 36 widows in their 70s, and it found that 1 month after bereavement, 89% of the women and 57% of the men reported some kind of after-death communication. This, although there is the same taboo there that there is here, maybe worse. But this researcher, this was I think a woman, said only after these widows and widowers were told that such sensations were common did they speak freely, expressing relief from thoughts that they might become or be considered insane. Now, a lot of these experiences are quite extraordinary, and just as the lights flashing for me might have been frightening if the circumstances had been different, they might have been frightening to people ordinarily, but they are almost always comforting. And I see some nodding heads. I always love to see nodding heads. Yeah, and so it's really intriguing to see this question, this phenomenon. The kind that are perhaps the most, what the people of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, used to call evidential or veridical, the ones that make you say this is hard evidence are the death coincidences. Sometimes people talk about them as crisis apparitions, but death coincidence is a subclass of a crisis apparition. And a death coincidence is when person A doesn't know person B is dying, let's say. Baby doesn't even know that they're ill or in danger. They're physically apart. It may be that they're hundreds or thousands of miles apart. And at the time of death, person A senses person B in some fashion. Now, apparitions are not very common. They're maybe 8% of the time, if that. But in other ways, they sense them. And so it can be the 5 senses. You can see something, you can hear a voice, you can feel a touch, you can get your message another way. The 3 most common ways to sense contact are an intense dream, the kind of dream that you're likely to remember afterwards in great detail, maybe for years. Telepathy, a telepathic message that may give you information you wouldn't otherwise have. And the third one is really, it sounds so subtle, but it's very intense for many people, and that is sense of presence. You just know the person's there, the spirit is there. And oftentimes one kind of contact is accompanied by another. You feel the presence, but you also feel a touch, or you get a telepathic message and you hear something, or whatever. People have mentioned hearing a key in the door. I want to read, because these come in so many ways, they're sometimes symbolic, they're sometimes so unusual that they don't fit what you expect somehow. So let me read 3 that I think are parallel. The first one comes from a woman who's actually a school aide, not very well educated, a religious Methodist. And this is what she sensed when her own mother was dying. The day my mom passed, I knew she was sick. I knew she was in the hospital, and so I was praying for her. And my bedroom became so dark as if death itself was on the doorstep. And I got up, went down and told my husband, Mom just passed away. She's a very, very sensitive woman. This was at 9 o'clock in the morning, and my husband says, no, don't accept it. Don't you believe it? So 3 o'clock, my brother called. I says, Butch, sit down. I want to talk to you. He said, okay. And so I said, Mom passed away at 9 o'clock this morning. He goes, how do you know? I said, I wasn't there, but the Lord told me this. Quit praying. Don't pray no more. So she sees this darkness, and she knows something. And she has a psychic message. Her story bears a striking resemblance to a tale I got from a book, originally told by Martin Buber, or rather retold by Martin Buber. It was first told by Eastern European Hasidic Jews about a tzaddik, a particularly holy man who sensed the passing of a beloved friend. The hour Rabbi Levi Yitzhak died, a tzaddik teaching in a distant city suddenly interrupted his discourse and said to his disciples, I cannot go on. Everything went dark before my eyes. The gates of prayer are closing. Something must have happened to the great worshipper, to Rabbi Levi Yitzhak. Now, I interviewed a man who brought me aside from his own experiences, he brought me in writing accounts of some family stories because there was a history of paranormal phenomena in the family. So this is what he gave me. The night my Uncle Ed died in World War II, my grandmother was sitting in the living room when she saw a black cloud obscure the light shining in the kitchen. She turned to my grandfather and announced that Ed was dead. News came from Washington several days later confirming her announcement. Now, the skeptics will say, well, you got some extraordinary data there, and actually this was something that the SPR, in the good old days of the late 19th century, they picked death coincidences as the strongest evidence you could have for this kind of contact, this paranormal contact. And as they said, you can only die once. And so, well, let's leave reincarnation and so, by the side there. But in any case, they said that since you can only die once, you can mathematically analyze the likelihood that someone, at a particular time that someone is dying, is going to have this contact experience. And the way it worked out, depending how you read the numbers, they checked it 2 different ways. It was, the odds were either 400 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. They discounted so many different cases that 2 different ways, 1,000 to 1, really is the way the numbers came out. But anyhow, people who are very skeptical will say, maybe at the time of death, the spirit of a human being or some faculty of the human being dying can somehow communicate with other beings. But then they question whether in later years or later time, any such communication can take place. So I have collected a lot of stories. I should have mentioned, I guess I never did mention, and neither did Lizette. This is based on interviews with 78 people, plus all the library research I did. And I've since interviewed a lot more people. But in any case, I've collected a number of stories that really make you think twice about that sort of thing. First, I'll read something from somebody who, unlike 99% of my interviewees, or I guess you can't have 99% with that kind of number, but anyhow, most of my interviewees wanted to be given her full name. And I was very fussy about the way I did these interviews. I didn't pay anyone anything, and I basically left them anonymous unless I promised them anonymity and used their first name if they wanted me to. Otherwise, I gave them whatever name they wanted me to use. There were a couple of exceptions, and because I'm in New York today, I'm going to give you the story from someone whose birth name was Sylvia Alda, A-L-D-A, like Robert Alda and Alan Alda. And she was adopted, and she wants any information about her birth family. So if anyone here knows anything about someone who was given the name Sylvia Alda, get to me about it. Anyhow, she's a very attractive, she was adopted, and she really needs this information. Anyhow, she has no memories of her natural mother, but she feels that she's been communicated with by her mother, a biological mother. And these are some stories of that. She says, the first dream that I really remember, I was probably around 19 years of age. My cat had kittens. I was going to give them away to everyone, and my birth mother came to me in a dream. In the dream, she came and sat in the back seat of a car with me while someone else was driving, and she told me, those kittens are all sick. They're all going to die. And I didn't believe her. My reaction was so strong that the dream ended. Then when I woke up, I was like, I wish I could have accepted that, because I know that was my mother. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that that was my mother. And sure enough, those cats died. They had something that was incurable already. The next time she came to me, I didn't feel right in my solar plexus area, but I didn't want to go to the doctor. I don't like doctors especially. I've always taken care of myself. But I had a dream where she lay down beside me, and this plug of mucus came out of me, and she was looking at it, and she was saying, you've got to get this checked out because it's not right. And again, I didn't want to believe her, and I was horrified, and I woke up. But I did make a doctor's appointment, and I went and checked on it, and I actually had to have surgery for a growth. It's a good thing I caught it. When my biological mother comes to me, she said, it's always something I don't want to hear. It's helpful, but it's not comforting. So this is a different kind of communication. I'm going to read you a couple of other accounts, or read you one and tell you about another, that also give help as well as information, help or information. Let's find this one. And this one was given to me by another very sensitive person who is a social worker. It's a little bit gory, but I think New Yorkers can take it. I've been told other places. I've had other audiences said, well, I don't know about that, you know. But anyhow, here we are. She was working in a halfway house for recovering addicts. And her boss there was an elderly physician named Mary, who was married to a man named Gabe, and they both lived in the house. And Anna, who gave me this, said, my mother is still alive, but Mary gave me mothering, so she was more than my boss. She was a mentor and a mother figure. There was a man that she'd asked to leave the house because he'd had sex with a woman there. This was a man who'd been in jail before, and he was being treated for addiction. He called up and he threatened Mary and everybody at the house. I wanted to call the parole officer, but Mary said, no, this is a house of love. We won't call the police. And I felt not good about this all day long. The next evening we had another threat. And as I sat with Mary, I did something that I'd never done before, which was lay my head in her lap, and she stroked my head. I told her how much it touched my heart and how much mothering I received just from this experience. Sometime during the night, this guy came in, and he shot Mary and Gabe at point-blank range. Then he took off in her car. So the next morning, as I was driving to work, I heard the news. By the time I got there, the bodies of Mary and her husband were being hauled away. Doors and everything were broken in. The police had everybody outside. The people who'd been staying in the house were hysterical because everyone was a wreck because these were fragile people already. The police let me in. I walked into Mary's room and I saw the bloody sheets. When I saw them, I almost threw up. But there was a window behind me, and at that instant, this ray of golden light came over my right shoulder into the room and down towards the sheets, and this peace came in. And I heard, "Don't make a scene, just do what's meant to be done. Put him in the new washer." And the person who told me this laughed. It was such a weird idea. That was the first thing I heard. I heard it in my head, but I heard it very clearly, and it was definitely this golden light. Once she had my attention, she made a joke. She says, "I guess from now on they'll call me Bloody Mary." Now her name was Mary, but Bloody Mary's an alcoholic drink, and she'd been in AA for 40 years and working with alcoholics. So then I said in my mind something like, "Where are you?" or "What happened?" or "What was it like?" It's like asking all these questions at once because it was such a shock. And her answer to me, she says, "It was just like, beam me up, Scotty." One minute I was asleep, and the next minute I was with all my old friends. And she says, "I've never forgotten that image of it being like, beam me up, Scotty. It reframed my whole concept of dying." That was one thing. The second thing was that it gave me the strength for the next 3 days to do a whole lot of stuff. Everybody else was in, and I love this way she describes it, everybody else was in drama and trauma and making big deals and fear and anger and everything else. I had to find places for people. I had to find places for the food. And I had to give away everything in the place to homeless shelters or whatever. So I had a huge amount to do. And that experience with Mary gave me the strength and the wisdom and the hope to go through the whole thing. Now, I also interviewed 2 sisters who were involved with a murder. It was a very interesting experience because the 2 of them in different ways participated in kind of a double event. Their brother had died, and this happened in the mother's house. These are 2 grown young women. And one sister, her name is Sarah, was sitting downstairs no, I guess it was Spring was downstairs in the kitchen with her mother, and suddenly the lights got bright, and they couldn't account for it. It just seemed like a strange thing to happen. Chris had been murdered. They were certainly mourning for Chris. He'd been murdered in Oakland, California. And upstairs at the same time was the other sister, who was Sarah. And Sarah had been looking for something that Chris had given her. And that was a little video that he'd given her, and it meant a lot to her. And she was looking in the room that had been Chris's room. She was looking and looking, and couldn't find it. And finally, both of these young women are pretty much attuned to the paranormal. She said, "Chris, help me. Chris, help me find this video." And so she felt him direct her. And she went to a closet, and she went to the back, and she went to a box, all as she was directed by Chris. And sure enough, she found the video. So she is, so amazed that this is happening. She runs downstairs, and at the very same time, the lights are getting brighter downstairs. So she comes down, and her mother and her sister are thinking that she's all excited because the lights have gotten brighter. And she says, no, I just found this video. So they had a shared experience. The 2 things happened at the same time. Well, this and other things that I collected set me to thinking about murders. Because, there's no one who's more obviously a bad guy than a murderer. And we all wonder what happens, in the afterlife. And I should say that, people say, terrible to commit suicide, and maybe you go to a special place or whatever. Everybody has collected stories of contacts with suicides, people who've committed suicide. It's very commonplace. Some of them are happy, some of them are less happy, but the fact is that they come through. But I had talked to several people who'd had contacts with murder victims, and no one who had contact from a murderer. So I sent out a kind of call to other people who work in the field, and I happened to be on an email discussion group where we discuss survival issues, and there are a lot of very, very well-informed people, and none of them had ever seen anything about a murderer coming through. And there's a book, I like to give plugs to books I think are very useful, a book that really it covers interviews with 2,000 people who sense contact of some sort with the dead. It's called Hello from Heaven, and it's by Judy and Bill Guggenheim. And it gives little thumbnail accounts of what people have experienced. And I want to read this quote. So it says, they said, "To our knowledge, no one who was interviewed had been contacted by anybody who had committed malicious crimes or atrocities." So it's kind of funny. You kind of wonder, as I said before, that it's shared human experience that has probably created some of these things that religions have given us. But it does appear there's strong evidence that you don't get away with murder somewhere or another. And if we live in a warrior society, if I may make a pitch, I don't know if I should or would, but you don't get away with murder. Anyhow, the most common messages that people receive, which are comforting, I mean, most are comforting, and this is what the most common ones are. The most common is probably, "Don't worry about me, I'm okay now," or "I'm happy now." Both of them. I've heard almost exactly the same words from so many people. I get so, gee, I've heard that before, It's not a new thing. The next most common is received by the person who has been grieving for a long time for somebody. And in some fashion, that lost person will communicate back and say, "Stop grieving, you've got to get on with your life." That's fairly common. A kind of contact that I'm very intrigued by is stories of reconciliation. And these are kind of a middle ground, because obviously there's lots of communication from spirits of people who, in one way or another, like most of us, were not perfect and had some problems with other people left behind. So a number of these were contacts with parent to child. So I'll read you a couple of those. The first one is one from Ronnie, and Ronnie is a woman. And Ronnie, when she was a child, had a very hard time with her mother. Her mother was actually psychotic. As Ronnie says somewhere else, "My mother never knew whether she wanted to love me or kill me or just, beat me up or whatever." And so she ended up just beating me up a lot. And so Ronnie was always very frightened of her mother. And after her mother died, Ronnie has a house out in Oregon, where same town I live. And Ronnie would go to her basement to do her laundry, and she sensed that her mother was in the basement. Her mother's spirit was there. And Ronnie simply could not accept this. She was so terrified automatically, even though she knew that her mother wasn't there to hurt her. She couldn't deal with it. And she said, "I got to the point where one day I said to her, 'Mom, I'll let it all go. You don't have to keep coming back to me to ask me forgiveness or anything. It's okay.' I knew that's what it was all about. It was that she just felt so bad about the past. I did a little ritual, salt, candles, everything down in the basement, because I practiced paganism to a certain extent. Then one Mother's Day I woke up, I went out on my deck, and I just shouted, 'Happy Mother's Day!' And I don't hate her anymore." So that was a little bit of that wasn't an all cheerful story. Some of the others are a little cheerier because Ronnie went through a lot of pain before she finally could accept this kind of reconciliation. But I have actually 3 parallel stories that come after that in the book, and I'll read 2 of them. And there are others as well that are these kind of reconciliation stories. Anyhow, Joanne is an attractive, capable woman in her mid-40s, and this is what she told me. My father and I had virtually no relationship for like 20 years before he died, which was fine with me. He was an alcoholic and a very violent man, and separation from him really did nothing but help the quality of my life. My father had gotten polio when he was a child. He was in a wheelchair his whole life, and he was very angry. In his time in society, if your legs were crippled, you were crippled. Nobody expected much of him, which was a shame because my father had a lot of talents and a lot of intelligence, so he was very bitter. Maybe he was just angry with God. When he got ill and the family realized he was dying, I'm the eldest of 5, my mother and the 5 of us kids went down to the hospital. He had basically kept contact open with everyone else but me and decided to see everyone else but me before he died, which was okay. She keeps saying it was okay. You know perfectly well it wasn't okay with her. I didn't expect the man to have any sudden revelation. I was okay with my life and my relationship, my other relationships. So anyway, he passed away. We had a small service, and that was that. Now, I am on the prayer team at my church. So I have regular prayer time and prayer practice. And one day, months after my father died, I was in prayer without any thought of my father, either that day or for weeks before. All of a sudden, I realized that my father was there with me in spirit. And it was like a door suddenly had opened. Now, this is a sense of presence. She's getting only a sense of presence and telepathy. At first, I was just shocked. I just sat there in sheer amazement that I was in the middle of this. Then I got to the awareness of what a gift I was being given, and I felt incredibly grateful. His presence stayed with me about 3 minutes. It was a pretty long length of time, and then suddenly the door closed. During that time, I came to know that my father really did love me. It was sudden and unexpected, and unplanned for. It went beyond apology. It was a pureness of love. And I should mention that she's saying that it was a pretty long length of time. It was 3 minutes. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people give me stories, and I'd say, well, how long did this take? You know, how long did you have this sensation? And they'd say, oh, it's 3 or 4 minutes. And these are so intense that people many years later remember those 3 or 4 minutes. It's epiphany, it's revelation. It's really amazing. And I'll give one more here. This is from Rosemary. She was one of 4 children, and she never got the attention she wanted from her father. Actually, she had a health problem that the others in the family didn't have, and she felt, I think, that somehow he slighted her for that reason. Anyhow, she says, his death didn't make a lot of difference to me. He had been sick quite a while. There was sorrow, but it was no big deal. Soon after he died, within a day or 2, I was writing a letter to a guy out of state, someone I'd never been real close to. I started to sense what at first I thought was this man's affection for me, a lot more than I'd ever sensed before. Suddenly, it's as if a voice started yelling at me, no, not him, me. And I knew it was my father. My father was telling me how much he loved me. I sensed this tremendous warmth. It was really, really powerful. I danced all around the living room. I never sensed his touch. He was just there. I remember he was telling me he loved me very much, and I swirled around the living room with my dad. I'm kind of closing in here. I think I have around 15 more minutes, and I'm going to give you a few more stories, a few more comments. Story from a woman named Paula, and Paula has a PhD in psychology and a very unusual specialty. And because she has this unusual specialty, she has taught in medical school this particular specialty. Anyhow, she had a brilliant son that we'll call Ari. He was a whiz at computers. When Ari was 30, he died suddenly of a chronic disease that is rarely fatal. At first, his mother was almost inconsolable. A year to the day after his passing, she moved into her summer home. She was trying to assemble the components of a computer system that had been disassembled the previous fall so that it could be stored elsewhere. And this is what she says. I revved up the computer and I was ready to put it all together, but I got these crazy error messages. Nothing was working. It was working enough so that I could get DOS error messages, but nothing would come up on the screen, just garbage. That evening, I gave up in despair. So it had been a year exactly to the day since he died. So she lit a memorial candle. She says, I lit a memorial candle for Ari and spoke to Ari a little bit, looked at some of the photographs, and I went to sleep. Woke up at 2 in the morning and I heard a voice say, go to the computer and I'll tell you what to do. I sat down. My husband is asleep in the bedroom and the computer is in the bedroom, but I turned it on and I'm sitting there in front of the screen and I am typing strings of computer commands in a language I don't know, because I don't know computer language. I have never programmed, never. But I'm typing these strings of commands that have symbols and letters and numbers. This goes on for about 45 minutes, strings and strings and strings of it. And then I hit enter and everything works. And I understood that Ari was there to talk me through this. And when I was finished and everything was working, it was now 3:30 or 4 in the morning, I went back to sleep and I slept very soundly. And in my sleep I heard Ari's voice say, now, Mom, you can't count on me doing this all the time. Now, Paula is somebody who was given this kind of sensitivity only well along in life after she'd been widowed, and before she was widowed, her dying husband had a near-death experience, and he kind of awakened her to the reality of some of these perceptions. There are people who are particularly sensitive, of course. We know there are mediums and there are psychics and so on. And I'd like to tell you about a couple of people who had help for years, that went on for years. Now, Connie grew up in a very, very troubled home. She, both with her mother and father, her father was an alcoholic, her mother would she felt kind of entice him prod him into more and more crazy behavior. And then her father left the picture and her stepfather moved in, and her stepfather and her mother would actually fight with knives, she said. It was blood. It was pretty grim. And she said she would go out and just sit outside by a pond, a little pool they had, and fish pool and fish pond, and even if it was raining, and this is Oregon, it was raining, and just pretend that they were not her parents, and just space out and try to get away from it all. So anyhow, her retreat during this period also was that she had a grandmother and her grandmother's son, who was her uncle, who had a house nearby, and sometimes she'd go there, and they actually were interested in the paranormal. They were reading books on things that were related. And so they were kind of a haven for her, a retreat and a haven for her. Well, she went on to to grow up, get a responsible job. As she was head of personnel when I interviewed her. She actually was retired by that time, but she had been head of personnel at a hospital. And every now and then, she said, an administrator or something would come to her and ask her a question, and she had no clue as to how she could possibly answer this question. But she would hear a voice, and it was a grandmother, or more likely her uncle, these people after they had passed on. And her uncle perhaps would just tell her the answer. And so she'd give the administrator this answer, and she'd run to see if she was right, check on the information. It was always right. And this went on for a number of years. And another person is actually someone that my husband and I knew before I ever interviewed him. He's a kind of a family friend very bright and interesting guy. He was a journalist with Life magazine in the great days of Life magazine, and actually split with Life because he didn't feel they were giving an authentic picture of the Vietnam War. Went on to have a whole different career. But anyhow, now Jerry also had a terrible childhood. Grew up in New England. His father was an alcoholic. He was raised by his father. His mother was an alcoholic in San Francisco. He was an alcoholic, and his father was an alcoholic in New England. And they were broke. They had no money. A lot of problems. Father was violent. Anyhow, Jerry is very, very sensitive, and when his glory days, when he was with Life magazine, he had a marriage which wasn't doing too well. He had 2 sons by that marriage, and then he met Jenny, who he always viewed as the love of his life, who had 2 daughters, and was in a marriage that wasn't so great. And the 2 of them coupled off. Left everyone behind and went off and eventually did get married, had yet another child. So now there were 5 children. They actually had custody of all these children. And then Jenny died. And Jerry was left with 5 children of varying ages. Well, he discovered that he'd go to bed at night, or after the kids were tucked into bed, and around 10 o'clock at night, he'd get this telepathic communication from Jenny. And Jenny would be with him for maybe 10 minutes. And she'd help him to raise the kids. She'd tell him what was happening with the kids that he might not otherwise know about. If, one of the kids got into a fight, or one of the kids was homesick for his biological mother and wanted to visit her, this would come to Jerry, and he mentioned particularly one daughter. Jenny told him that this daughter was stealing things at school and also stealing them from him, and he went to his daughter and he said, what's happening? Are you stealing? And she said, no, Daddy, I'm not stealing. Years later, she said, yes, I was stealing. So he's absolutely convinced he had these communications. I kind of gave you a little clue in those 2 stories, because I've been doing a lot of work on what makes a sensitive. When I did my interviews, I didn't just ask people about their experiences of after-death communication. I asked them about their childhoods. And what I was really looking for was, I thought that maybe if people had a particular kind of upbringing with respect to belief in the paranormal or in organized religion, it would affect them in some way. So I asked these questions, but when I was asking these questions, I did it in a little bit atypical way, because I always told people first that I myself had had these experiences. So I kind of gave them permission to open up to me more than they otherwise might. And I had very free-form interviews. What can you tell me? Well, what else can you tell me? Well, give me the details. Where was this? When was this? This sort of thing. And as a result, I think people opened up to me to a rather extraordinary degree. And I started learning the most unexpected things. And after I'd done around 15 interviews, I realized that 4 or 5 of the people had made mention of having alcoholism in the family when they were kids, when they were very small. And this didn't sound, statistically it didn't sound right. I have, among other things, a background in sociology and social science statistics and all those dreary things. Anyhow, so I checked with the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. And sure enough, this was strange. This was like 2 or 3 times as much as you would predict. So I added a question to my interviews, and I said, would you say, this is a question about your childhood, your background, would you say that your childhood was generally pleasant, or was it difficult? I mean, that was about as vague as I could make it. And if someone just didn't want to get into something that was difficult, we left it at that. If they said it was difficult, I'd ask why. In what way? And what I came up with was 2 different kinds of stress in childhood, and one of them is alcoholism. The other group that I came up with was people who had 1 or more parents who had what I named sort of a AAA kind of a background or style, and that was authoritarian, angry, abusive. Authoritarian, angry, abusive. One of the people I talked to about this said that in our family they called it a rageaholic. So you just try as a little kid living with a rageaholic, and you start getting these changes in, and maybe in your brain. You know, there are a number of things that happen in a child's brain. People didn't realize until fairly recently certain things about the development of a child's brain. And you start out when you're an infant with this enormous number of neurons and synapses and so on, and then at some point, depending on which ones have been utilized and which have not, a lot of them disappear. In fact, the great majority of them disappear, and you're left with sort of a skeletal remains of what you could have had. And so maybe we all start out with the potential to be very, very psychic. But if we don't have the right or the appropriate stimuli to maintain that, those particular neurons and synapses are lost. And good examples of the kind of things you have to learn when you're a small child and can never really learn as well afterwards are learning of how to speak a language without an accent. Or what is even more intense is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with perfect pitch or absolute pitch, the ability to identify, you know, if someone sings a pitch, you know not just that it's a fifth from this or a quarter, you know, whatever from another pitch, but you actually know it's middle C or it's F sharp or whatever. You just know. And if you don't learn that by the time you're 3 or 4 years old, it's almost impossible ever to learn that. And in fact, that's an argument for the Suzuki method of learning how to play the violin. It actually gives children perfect pitch. So anyhow, this is all something that I think there should be more research on as to what part of the brain might actually contain the centers for this kind of awareness. And I'm not going to get into it because I think we're running a little late here. But it's in the book. It's at the very end on who becomes a sensitive, because I think I've pinpointed a very good place to look for this kind of sensitivity. And I've been writing articles like crazy, including one for the International Journal of Parapsychology, that touch on this whole issue of where are we going to look for this material spot in the brain where sensitivity to psi may very well be located. Anyhow, I'm going to move on. We've had some very dark stories about murders and illness and whatever, but I'd like to give you a couple of more fun stories. The first one is about a woman who went to visit her aunt, where her grandmother had lived before. Her grandmother was still alive. Oh no, I guess her grandmother was dead. And she's a grown woman, this person, Alice, who told me this story. And she went to, actually from the West Coast, she went to upstate New York, to this town where her grandmother had lived as a young woman. And actually had lived there, and her mother had also been brought up there. So she went to this town. She was with her husband and children, and they were going into a bookstore, and then she suddenly sensed her grandmother's presence. And so she told her husband and kids, you know, go on into the bookstore, I'll meet you later. And she sensed her grandmother saying, I'll show you where I lived. And she was guided, you know, step by step and block by block to an unusual street with an unusual location. And she looked at this house, and this was supposed to be where her grandmother lived. And then she went back and she joined her family in the bookstore, went back west and talked to her mother about this. And her mother said, yes, that's where your grandmother lived. That's where I started at. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you about was Anna, that I mentioned before, was a social worker. She had an aunt who did die, and she and the aunt were very, very close. They looked alike. They had a lot of traits in common, and they were both chocoholics. But her aunt wasn't supposed to eat chocolate. She was a diabetic, and she wasn't supposed to eat chocolate, but she did anyhow. So late at night, Anna has gone to this house. It's shortly after her aunt died. There were several members of the family came and had some kind of a weekend meeting of some sort at this house. And she went downstairs because she had a yen for something to eat. She goes downstairs to the kitchen. There's nobody there. The lights start flashing. I have a lot of stories about lights flashing. And she says, oh, I sense that she was there. She says, if you're here, where's the chocolate? So she gets this information and, says, well, it's behind you. And you go to that cupboard over there, and you go inside the cupboard, and you go way to the back on the left. Of course, she found the chocolate. Afterwards, she had her husband check the light switch and so on to see why the lights had done that, and he couldn't find anything wrong with it. So it was another indication of contact. Anyhow, I'm going to close with this one story, and it's maybe a bit of a tearjerker, but I don't think you can top this one for contact. I should say I've collected a number of stories that have to do with animals, and this is a story about a hero dog. But there are a lot of people sense contact through the behavior of creatures, like sometimes birds that give them information, or they sense a spirit contact them through a bird or a horse or a fox or whatever. A lot of animals. But the dogs are way up on the list. They're wonderful contacts. Anyhow, I got this from a woman named Summer, who was a dance teacher and a dance ethnologist. So she taught courses on more than just how to dance. So she told me this extraordinary story about a soldier in Vietnam and his beloved dog. A friend of hers in San Antonio, Texas, a golf pro, shared this experience with her. She starts out this way. Bob said, I was in Vietnam, and I was in the thick of a firefight in the jungle, and I was with like a dozen guys, and they were in the jungle, and all of a sudden they received a direct hit. So by this time she's talking in her own voice. Several of his friends were killed outright. He was badly wounded, a head wound. Blood started flowing down into his eyes, and he got lost. He was calling out to his friends, but he couldn't find anyone. All of a sudden, his dog, Rusty, was right in front of him, a little Cocker Spaniel, and Rusty was jumping up and down and barking. This was his dog from home, an old dog, Bob's childhood dog. He was raised with this dog all through middle school and teenage. And Bob said, it was just real clear to me. He was barking. And when I went to pet him, he ran off down the trail right ahead of me and kept barking and was leading me down the trail. He couldn't see because of the blood in his eyes, but that dog stayed right in front of him, barking. He led him right down the trail, and Bob staggered back to our headquarters. As soon as he came into the clearing, they rushed up and put him on a stretcher and took him to the hospital. He was in the hospital 2 weeks, and then, what was it Vietnam guys call it? That was his ticket home. He had a bad enough wound to go home, but he's not disabled or anything. So he came home, got off the plane at San Antonio, hugged his mom and relatives, and as soon as they had their first round of hugs, he said, how's Rusty? And his mom said, well, son, I didn't want to tell you, but he died of a heart attack. He didn't suffer or anything. He died suddenly. So Bob said, when? And it was the date and time. And Bob always will believe that his dog died of a heart attack when he was wounded. Died of a heart attack when he was wounded and then went to save him. So when I heard this story, I said, that's real love. And Summer responded, real love. They could teach us a few. So I can't top that one. Thank you very much. Yes?
Are you doing any further follow-up study regarding the connection you seem to have made between children with AAA parents and their psychic abilities, or has anyone else yet taken note of that particular possible connection?
Well, there is a lot of data on this, and it's in the book. I think that people have noted it in different ways. Like there's a fairly old sociological study that was done by a man who's kind of a mentor of mine, Andrew Greeley, and he has been associated for many years with the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. And so he was in a position, he's also a Catholic priest and a sociologist and a very famous novelist. He wrote The Cardinal Sins and a number of other books. But in any case, he managed to sneak into a very general survey, some questions that basically revealed stress in the family, were indicators of stress in the family. And he came up with the finding that stress in childhood does tend to create psychics. And it's not as strong for the medium level psychics, but the intensely psychic ones are more likely to have intense stress in childhood. But as he said at the time, he wasn't happy about the way he was doing it, because when you do that kind of a survey, you just have yes and no answers, and you can't pursue and you can't get more data. And there are also there's a whole string of studies that were done, and I don't have them all in hand or even make reference to them exactly in the book. I don't give the citations. Incidentally, the book has notes in the back, and anything I say which sounds like it ought to be substantiated, I have pages at the back which will tell where it comes from. But in any case, in the 1980s or so, there were psychologists who noted that children or people who had stress in their early childhood tended to have more belief in the paranormal. So they made the assumption, or they came to the conclusion that these children tended to dissociate, and they developed a tendency to fantasy. And a fellow named Tony Lawrence, who is a psychologist and interested in the paranormal in England, did a statistical survey on these studies, and he showed there was a stronger connection between stress in childhood, trauma, and belief in the paranormal than between stress, trauma in childhood, and fantasizing. So that intervening variable doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. It works another way. And there are other things in the book that relate to this. So in a way, the evidence is there, but I don't think anyone has pulled it together in quite the same way. And I haven't seen anything that talks about alcoholism, although God knows I've been to so many parties or, meet strangers, and they start saying some events that have happened to them or whatever, because I talk about what I do. And I'll say this thing about, I find, that the children of alcoholics, they make this reaction to me like, oh God, you're talking about me. Or the other thing about a sort of a very difficult parent in some other way. But sometimes I do so often ask people, can you tell me about your childhood? Was it generally pleasant or was it difficult? And I get answers like a living hell, And it may not be either one of these two things. One woman really floored me. She gave me a 3-word answer, and it just created such a picture. She said, 2 bipolar parents. Can you imagine living with 2 bipolar parents? Not easy. Yes?
Well, in fact, I did. And I guess the theory I'm at the moment most comfortable with is that if you're young, you need some kind of Darwinian adaptive strategy to predict what kind of rage is going to happen and how and when. So it could be that there's this lost evolutionary skill that we may have needed earlier on. This is purely speculation on my part. But that you're kind of scanning the environment to see what's going to happen because nothing is predictable. And so maybe these psychic gifts are just a natural response to being overloaded with unpredictability.
Yeah, well, that's actually, I would say there are 2 basic theories. That's one of them. The other one is dissociation.
Yeah.
And so you're listening to something inside rather than external. But it may be that they're both true.
They could both be true.
Yeah. Yeah.
I used to teach a class on intuition development, and I noticed that the people who had traumatic childhoods or alcoholism in their childhood were more naturally sensitive, but they tended to tune into the more difficult pieces because they've been trying to block their intuition. They both had been a survival skill for them growing up, but they had overloaded a lot. So they picked up when people were dying, when people were hurt, and where the problem was. But it was harder for them to begin to use their intuition on who liked them, where there was opportunities, or where there was positive. That was a muscle they had to really develop over time to be able to use intuition, to not just as ducking, but to broaden it a bit.
That's really fascinating. Every now and then I get a question that, or a comment that makes me think, you know, and I can to a degree see that in myself, you know. That's really an amazing insight. Yes?
Actually, I was going to ask something about that. I almost wondered whether that could be the same thing. I mean, whether children of alcoholic or rageful parents or children of psychic parents, whether those are two options for the same sort of sensitivity to go. If somebody grew up in a family where being very, very sensitive, being emotionally responsive, empathetic to your environment wasn't really an option, then that might make you rageful, alcoholic. So perhaps the connection, I was trying to figure that out, what could be the connection between, you know, a psychic child and a rageful parent. Perhaps there's, you know, an untapped commonality there. Perhaps they're very, very similar people. Perhaps this is why the alcoholic parent might come and visit, you know, later in life, as though, you know, if I had been born one generation later, if I had been born to a different family, if I had been born with a different set of options, perhaps I would have been more of a poet like you say. You know, for instance, I think that maybe, you know, maybe they're the same brain capacities in some ways. I've even heard research along those lines that people who develop alcoholism, there's some, you know, chromosome or something which is also connected to, you know, other mental capacities. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, well, it's figuring out causation is really very, very difficult. Things are very tangled to say what causes what. Actually, I've had people say to me who were the children of alcoholics, particularly a daughter of a father, they'll say, well, he was really very sensitive, but he tried to dull it. And so he would drink to sort of mute it. And then where does it all go? There's another whole area that I haven't got, you know, I haven't written it down. I feel even a little uneasy about it. But I every now and then spill the beans to an audience. There's a woman who's done some very interesting work on second sight, which is very common in what's called the Western Isles and Highlands of Scotland. These are quite remote areas. They're very sparsely populated. The weather is ghastly, and I've been there. I did, you know, part of my research was when I got to Scotland, I went off to the Highlands and Western Isles, and boy, of course their main export is booze, you know, is Scotch, and there's a lot of drinking there, of course, also. Anyhow, it's very common in the Highlands and Western Isles, and it runs in families, and so you get a family pattern. But I didn't have access to her data, you know, the raw data, and her raw data would not have included whether there was alcoholism or rageaholic behavior. But I did go to the library in Edinburgh, and I'm touching your mic, I'm sorry. I went to the library in Edinburgh, the National Library, and I checked on alcoholism. And this is the area where there's so much psychic ability, second sight. It's also the highest level of alcoholism.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I've just come back from Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Where I was throwing my father's ashes in the sea, actually. And it was quite a trip. My father was not an alcoholic, and I'm not either, but he did go into trances and speak in tongues. And when I was a teenager, that was just, you know, bizarre, just whatever. Now, my job is storytelling, and I can see that I can see that the sort of surrender to this utterance that you're more a channel for than an author of is something that, so I think that, sometimes what seem like disparate differences between people are often, commonalities after all, or something like that.
Yes?
You were just mentioning about Scotland and these studies among these people and connection between alcoholism and trauma. It just makes me wonder, these numbers that we're finding of psychically sensitive people coming from families where there was some kind of abuse, are those American statistics? Or, if you go to other countries where belief in psychic abilities is more commonplace, do you find the same kinds of numbers? Do you know if there are studies doing that? In a place like India, are the most sensitively or psychically sensitive people those who also come from traumatic childhood?
I don't know, and I have a feeling that if we were doing work in India, we'd have to deal with such a totally different culture, and what the expectations of what was considered normal, it would be very, very different. I also don't know to what extent there is alcoholism in India, but we have data on Scotland, we have data on the United States, we have data on England, and it's another question to be answered. Anybody else? Jeff?
Mostly you talked about people being visited by someone they knew, particularly. How about just being vulnerable to arbitrary visits from people you don't know, and feeling what happened to them if you get within their range or...
Oh boy, yeah. Yeah, we're getting to the really sensitive people, yeah. We're getting to the natural...
They play with you. They'll do little things to really, sometimes either make you laugh or scare you.
Well, I won't try to get into that. I'll tell you what I do know about contact with people or reactions to people who are not directly, not someone you've been very close with. I talked to a woman who, on a couple of occasions, felt terribly depressed and teary, crying. She had crying jags. And that went on for days or weeks, and she couldn't understand why, because there was no one in her immediate circle that was in any difficulty. And this happened to her before Indira Gandhi died, and before, I'm trying to think, the man in Egypt, what was his name? When these two people were assassinated, right beforehand, she had this terrible, ominous feeling, and she cried. She mourned them. Obviously very aware of political things. She's a very educated, politically aware person, and she sensed this beforehand. The other thing is that people who are sensitives often get messages for other people. And so it's not somebody that matters to them, it's that they are the conduit for information. So that's where you get the natural mediums. People who'll say, gee, I just know that, so-and-so's sister-in-law is going to have an operation. I just know it. Or I know so-and-so's coming for a visit. Or they're the same sort of people also who, if they have somebody's wallet in their hand, they know something about that person. And that there are a lot of these abilities that start very, very young, and you never get them as much. Now, you can learn a foreign language when you're grown, and you can improve your accent. It's never going to be as good. And my own experience has been that if you open yourself to this sort of thing, and you learn more about it, you do become more sensitive. There's no doubt about it. I see again the nodding heads. Yes?
I'm interested in the phenomenon of the electricity that you talk about in so many of your stories. When it happens in my circle, in my family, everyone's first suspicion is get an electrician in.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the theories behind why it happens with light?
Long before I even started seriously researching this, I heard that electromagnetic fields are thought to be related to a lot of paranormal phenomena. And I'm not much of a physicist. In fact, I'm not a physicist, and I can't really tell you much more about it than that. But I think the kinds of experiences people have are just beyond get an electrician. They're just so convincing. In fact, I usually have paper clips to all these stories that I tell, but I'm going to try and find you. Well, I guess I can remember it. The woman told me about something where it had sort of jumped from one generation to another. And it seems to me, there were things where a family of engineers, you know, like dad's an engineer and his son's an engineer and somebody else is an engineer, and they were having experiences where, for instance, I think the son said something about how he had to go to meetings or come home from work at a certain time, and all the lights, you know, the street lights would blink as he went by. I've had the same experience. Now, you don't send an electrician out to do all the street lights. And his father, before he died, had similar manifestations from his father. And the wife who told me these stories said how she was, shortly after her husband died, she was sitting in, he had died of these long, painful illnesses, and they had put his hospital bed in the dining room, I think it was, because it was convenient for various reasons. And she went, and it also was the place where they had the hi-fi or whatever it was, and she wanted to meditate. So she went in there to put on some music. And they had a chandelier, I guess, over the dining table, which had all these little lights. And suddenly, the lights all the way around, rotated around, just zip, all lit up in a cycle like Christmas lights. And at first it startled her. And she realized, you know, there was no, she checked everything, she checked the switches, she went and checked the, you know, the circuit breakers or whatever. There was no accounting for it. It just happened. It was a greeting, as far as she could tell. But this was, you know, one electrical thing after another. And I have, in the book, I mention that there's a very interesting story. It goes back to the early 20th century in a book by Sir Oliver Lodge, who was a physicist. And those of you who are familiar with the Society for Psychical Research probably know his name, because he was one of the great figures in that era. And he wrote this book after his son died in World War I, Raymond. And his son had been trained as a mechanical engineer, and he himself was a physicist. They were having a sitting, and his son was communicating. It was one of these things where they, table tipping thing. And at some point he asked his son, "How do you do this?" And he said, letter by letter, he gave this message, and I have it in the book, that they're all sitting around a table, a very small table. They're not very many people, just a few people. And their hands are on the table. And he says, you put the energy into the table. It collects in the medium, and then we manipulate. When do we say it's proved? You know, and if people have spent they have an investment in saying, well, I'm a skeptic. This is the open-minded skeptic's guide. What's the point of being a skeptic if you're not an open-minded one? I recently read a book that's a biography of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was not exactly a stupid man. He was trained as a physician, and he also was a creator of Sherlock Holmes. He was noted from everywhere for having been so brilliant. And he was a member of the SPR. He left because he felt that they were just spinning their wheels. They'd proven it. And he went out, wrote a book on the subject. He had to self-publish it. And then he went and spent the last 15 years of his life making all these talks to people, trying to promote this idea. Well, you know, at what point do we say we're convinced? So it's a funny thing. It brings to mind some things, some really nasty things that various people have said. I can't remember which one it was. When some of these great physicists of the early 20th century said something like, you don't a new idea doesn't come into acceptance because you convince people. It's because the older generation dies and the new ones accept it. They know it's true. So anyhow, I think I'm going to quit now with a laugh. Always leave them laughing, you know.
That's right. And it was a wonderful job.
And
Hi there, I'm Lisette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.